Miles Porter never expected the night he pushed a mop across an empty hallway to become the night that would upend an entire company. But when he glanced through the glass wall of a boardroom filled with collapsing code and panicked executives, something inside him stirred, something he had buried years ago. Before he knew it, the janitor everyone overlooked was holding the future of a $100 million contract in his hands, while the coldest CEO in Boston watched from the shadows. What happened next would shatter egos, ignite rivalries, and force the world to ask one question. What if the person you dismissed was the only one who could save you? By the third night, Apex Quantum Labs felt less like a tech company and more like an ICU ward for a dying patient no one knew how to save. The top-floor boardroom in the Boston Tower was lit up like a crime scene. Error charts bled red across a 40-foot LED wall. Lines of code flashed and flickered, stubborn and chaotic, as if the system itself were mocking the 20 experts crowded around the table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston Harbor was wrapped in winter fog, the Zachem Bridge glowing faintly in the distance like a heartbeat on a failing monitor. Inside, the air was worse than the fog: stale coffee, cold sweat, and something heavier: fear. Reagan Cole stood at the head of the table, and the room might as well have been a courtroom. At 42, she was the kind of CEO who was either admired or feared, never ignored. Her dark hair was pinned into a sharp knot, not a strand out of place. Her navy suit looked like it had been tailored with a knife. The only jewelry she wore was a slim steel watch, ticking louder in the silence than any of the machines. "We've burned through 3 days," she said, voice cool and precise. 6 emergency reviews, $500,000 in outside consultants. She lifted her hand toward the wall of red. "And what do we have to show for it?" No one answered. On the screen, the core AI model that was supposed to secure a $120 million contract with a Chicago client was falling apart in real time. Predictions drifted, latency spikes surged, error rates climbed like a bad fever chart. It wasn't just embarrassing. If this went wrong, it would cost Apex contracts, reputation, and possibly Reagan's own job. "What we have," she said quietly, "is a mess." Around the table, shoulders sunk a little lower, eyes dropped to laptop screens, not because there was anything useful there, but because no one wanted to be caught looking at her. Reagan checked the time on her watch. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "I want a solution, not another apology." Then she turned and walked out, leaving a silence so thick it felt physical. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded, to some, like a judgment. Out in the hallway, under the harsh white of recessed lights, a man in a faded gray uniform pushed a cleaning cart past the executive offices. Miles Porter looked exactly like what people thought he was: a night janitor. The uniform was worn to a dull shine at the sleeves, and his sneakers had seen better years. One earbud dangled from his ear, playing a podcast about fixing leaking pipes. His shoulders were broad from years of physical work, but there was something sharper in his face, something alert, that didn't quite match the mop in his hand. A soda can rolled lazily out of an overstuffed trash bin and bumped against his foot. He bent to pick it up, dropped it into a bag, and straightened. That was when he saw the boardroom. Through the glass wall, the massive LED screen glared half red, half white, and across the whiteboard to the side, someone had filled every inch with equations, graphs, loops, and nodes. It was a battlefield of symbols, and from halfway down the hall, it called to something inside him that he had worked very hard to bury. Miles stopped walking. For a moment, the hallway, the cart, the mop, the podcast in his ear, all of it blurred. All he could see was the broken logic on that board. It looked wrong, not in the way beginners got things wrong, but in the way smart people did when they got too close, too tired, and too proud to step back. 5 minutes later, the engineers filed out of the room in groups of 2 and 3. Their voices were low, their faces tight, lit by laptop screens and shame. No one noticed the janitor standing to the side. No one ever did. When the last of them turned the corner, the boardroom was empty. The lights were still on. Miles pushed his cart closer, heart thudding in his chest for reasons that had nothing to do with the weight of his cleaning supplies. He eased the door open, stepped inside, and let it whisper shut behind him. For a long beat, he just stood there, the mop in his hand and the whiteboard in front of him, like the past and present staring each other down. He walked up to the board and raised the rag in his hand. He was supposed to wipe it all away. Instead, he froze. "Wait," he said under his breath. He wasn't looking at symbols now. He was seeing structure, pathways, misaligned weights, the kind of flaw you felt before you could fully explain it. Someone had inverted a logic path deep in the model, then tried to patch the damage on top. It was like building a skyscraper on a tilted foundation and then wondering why the windows kept cracking. His pulse picked up, an old rhythm he hadn't felt since his nights in a lab at MIT, before life turned into hospital halls and funeral homes and a 3-year-old daughter asking why mommy wasn't coming back. He should have walked away. Instead, he grabbed a red marker. With quick, decisive strokes, he drew a clean sigmoid curve over a jagged one, circled 2 variables that should never have traded places, and underlined a misweighted node like it was a loose screw holding together an entire machine. "They've been looking at this backwards," he muttered. "And you think you've got it right?" The voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Miles almost dropped the marker. He turned. Reagan Cole stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hallway lights. Arms crossed, eyes narrow, she looked less like a CEO and more like a cross-examining attorney who had just caught a witness doing something they shouldn't. "I wasn't trying to mess with anything," Miles said quickly. "I just saw something off." Reagan didn't answer. She walked straight past him, stopping inches from the board. Her perfume was faint, clean, expensive. Her eyes tracked every line of red he'd drawn. Then, without a word, she pulled a tablet from her jacket, tapped into the live model, and keyed in his changes exactly as he'd written them. Miles watched the screen over her shoulder, his throat going dry. If he was wrong, this was the moment it would blow up in his face. 6 seconds passed. 8. The metrics flickered, recalculated, and snapped into a new configuration. "Accuracy up 18.7%, Reagan said, voice flat. "Error reduced 61%. Latency shaved by 19 milliseconds. She lowered the tablet slowly and turned to face him fully for the first time. "Miles Porter," she said, as if reading his name off a file only she could see. "Night janitor." She flicked her gaze to the marker in his hand, then back to his face. "MIT, AI track, left junior year, widower, single father, daughter's name, Tessa." The air left his lungs. He had no idea how she knew all that, but of course she did. Reagan was the kind of person who weaponized information. "Do you understand what you just did?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "I wasn't trying to step on anyone's toes," he said. "I just figured, if the bathtub's clogged, you don't keep pouring in more hot water. You unclog the drain." One corner of her mouth twitched. For Reagan Cole, that was practically a grin. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Strategic Conference Room C," she said. "You're on the observer list." "I really don't need to be in anybody's way," Miles started. "I've got Tessa's school drop-off and my shift, and—" "This isn't a suggestion, Mr. Porter," Reagan said. "It's an instruction." She walked to the door, then paused, one hand on the handle. "Give your daughter one more reason to be proud of her father," she said without looking back. Then she was gone. Miles stood alone in the boardroom, the hum of the LED wall filling the silence. He looked at the red marks on the board, at the mop standing in the corner, at his reflection, faintly visible in the glass. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. "Well," he said quietly to the mop, "looks like we might both be getting a promotion." That night, when he got home to their small apartment in East Boston, Tessa was already asleep, one arm flung over her head, her stuffed polar bear tucked under the other. Miles stood in the doorway for a long minute, watching her chest rise and fall, thinking about how fragile everything in his life still felt. Then he went to the tiny kitchen table, pulled out an old notebook, and started sketching the model he'd corrected from memory. His handwriting was tighter now, more cautious. But as the pages filled, the part of him he thought he'd buried under grief and bleach and fatigue began to stir again. By the time he finally slept, the winter sky outside the window was turning the color of steel. The next morning, 10 minutes before 8, Miles stood outside Conference Room C in the cleanest button-down shirt he owned. The faint coffee stain near the hem refused to disappear, but he had ironed the collar 3 times. His worn leather satchel hung heavy on his shoulder. Inside it was a notebook, a mechanical pencil, and a folded drawing Tessa had insisted on slipping into his bag. On the paper, in bright marker colors, a man held a mop in one hand and a lightning bolt in the other. Miles touched the edge of the drawing for luck, took a breath, and walked into the room where no one expected a janitor to belong. As you watch Miles walk into that conference room, would you have trusted someone like him, with his uniform and his past, to touch a $120 million project if you were in Reagan's place, yes or no? The moment Miles stepped into Conference Room C, he felt the shift in the air. This wasn't the quiet tension of the night shift or the lonely hum of empty hallways. This was pressure with teeth. Engineers, data scientists, and managers filled the oval table, their laptops open and their eyes sharp. Some glanced at him with mild curiosity, others with open confusion, and a few with a kind of subtle disdain reserved for people who didn't belong. Reagan entered seconds later, and all sound evaporated. She didn't have to say a word. Her presence alone commanded silence. "That's your seat," she said, pointing to a chair on the outer edge of the table. Miles nodded and sat. A few engineers exchanged awkward glances. Others avoided eye contact entirely. One man finally spoke. Jared Klein, senior systems engineer, Harvard MBA, perfect hair, perfect tie, and the kind of polished confidence that always seemed to tilt slightly upward, like he was looking down on everyone. "With respect," Jared said, folding his arms, "a correction made by someone without an engineering background, let alone a degree, is statistically far more likely to be a fluke. We shouldn't rely on an accident." Reagan didn't flinch. "Run the model." Jared's jaw tightened, but he typed the parameters into his laptop. The simulation generated in seconds. The predictive loop flowed cleanly. No spike, no drift, no collapse. The room shifted, the weight of the evidence settling on everyone. Still, Jared pressed on. "Fine, it worked once. That doesn't mean it will hold under scale, or that it should influence decisions made at this level." Miles felt eyes on him. Some curious, some skeptical, some quietly hostile. He didn't speak until the silence stretched so thin it might break. "If it's a fluke," he said calmly, "then I hope you're smart enough to learn from the fluke." A couple of people smothered a laugh. Someone else cleared their throat to cover it. Jared's face barely moved, but his displeasure pulsed like heat. Reagan's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a cool finality. "Proceed with the optimized version," she said. "Full implementation." Jared didn't argue, not directly, but the room felt colder after that. When the meeting ended, people filtered out in small clusters. Some avoided Miles entirely. Others gave him polite nods that felt more like calculated distancing than courtesy. Their careers depended on predictable systems. He was an unpredictable variable. Miles didn't wait for validation. He simply grabbed his satchel and headed for the elevators. The day was far from over. Hours later, after finishing his shift cleaning the lobby floors, Miles caught sight of someone in the reflection of a glass wall. Reagan stood there, no longer in her military-precise suit, but in a long camel coat, the collar turned up against the wind. She held a slim folder in one hand. "You're done for the night?" she asked. "Just wrapped up." "I need to talk," she said. "Not in an office, somewhere quieter." Miles raised a brow. "Is this another instruction?" She looked him dead in the eye. "Take it how you want." They walked out into the cold night, crossing the quiet streets toward the north end. As they moved, the scent of roasted garlic and warm bread drifted through the air, mixing with the sharp smell of the ocean. Christmas lights wrapped around lampposts and windows glowed like small fireplaces against the winter fog. Reagan brought him to a small Italian restaurant tucked into a corner. The sign was old, the doorbell slightly crooked, and the warmth inside wrapped around them like a blanket. Mismatched tables, worn leather chairs, and dim lights made it feel more human than anything inside Apex Quantum Labs. Reagan chose a seat by the window. Her posture softened, and her hair, now loose over her shoulders, made her seem like a different woman entirely. Less steel, more heart. "You look different without the mop," she said, eyes scanning him. "And you look different without the entire company on your shoulders," Miles replied, pulling out the chair opposite hers. She didn't smile at that, but something in her face relaxed. The waiter brought garlic bread and chain. They ate in silence at first. The good kind of silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Eventually Reagan spoke. "You want the truth? I asked you here because I haven't had a real conversation in years. A human one, not a performance, not a negotiation, a conversation." Miles's voice softened. "You ever tried taking a day off?" "My therapist suggested that once," she said. "He quit after 2 sessions." Miles burst into a laugh so full and genuine that 2 diners turned to look. Reagan's eyes widened before she let out a tiny, startled laugh of her own, as if she hadn't heard that sound from her own throat in a long, long time. For the next hour, they shared stories. Reagan spoke about her mother teaching her that emotion was a luxury in suits. Miles told stories of Tessa's impossible bedtime arguments and the cinnamon-scented winter mornings that reminded him painfully of his wife. Something shifted between them, layer by layer. When they stepped out onto the street, the fog was thicker and the air colder, but neither of them walked quickly. Their steps synced without effort. At the corner where their paths diverged, Reagan's voice was low. "Tomorrow you'll be stepping into a different room. Bigger stakes, bigger eyes. It's untested at scale," he said, eyes sliding toward Miles. "No precedent, and it was written by someone who has never run a production deployment. Someone who doesn't have an engineering degree. The room chilled. Some engineers shifted uncomfortably. Miles breathed slowly. He wasn't going to fold. I get it, he said. I'm not the person you expected. But the code works. The numbers speak. The question isn't who fixed it. It's whether it's fixed. If I wore a $1,000 suit with a degree on the wall, you'd call it genius. But because I push a mop at night, you call it a risk. Silence. Reagan didn't hesitate. Implement the update. Jared's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Later, Miles found Reagan on the rooftop again. The city stretched beneath them like a living map of lights. She didn't turn when he stepped up beside her. They're not used to someone like you, she said. Someone like me, he asked. Someone they can't categorize.